introduction. For that I mean 2 minutes. On really what's the role of your organisation in protecting the consumer. So we're going to start with you first.
Yes, well, which is obviously an independent consumer organisation. We campaign for consumers, and we see our mission is to make people as powerful as the organisations that they have to deal with in their everyday lives. So we have a role providing information to consumers, but also campaigning to make sure that people are properly protected. In terms of responsibility, I think in this area there's no doubt that everybody is responsible. Consumers obviously have to take responsibility to deal with the things that are in their control, and I think some of the things that we've talked about, things like handling poultry safely, that's very clearly something that people need to be doing. But I think the difficulty is that we're often dealing with risks that aren't in people's own control, and therefore people are very reliant on the people who are producing the food, whether that's food retailers, manufacturers, or also caterers, to be providing safe food to them. And I think we talked a lot about sort of microbiological risks, but when we're dealing with things like chemical risks or some of the sorts of new technologies that may be producing longer-term risks that we don't fully understand, where there's a lot of uncertainty, obviously we're in quite different territory then when we're talking about what balance of controls we have in place and how much choice you give to people versus how much you need to ensure that they're protected.
So, thank you, Sue. David.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I should perhaps just qualify my role on the panel. The BRC actually is in 2 parts.
Yep.
Part of which is the policy side of BRC, which represents the retailers. The other part, which I represent, is the global standards part. So, in terms of sort of responses today, I'm talking very much from the point of view of global standards, not representing retailers. I don't have the authority to do that. So, putting myself out of So, in respect of the global standards, our role very much is about trying to condense the best food safety practice by talking to the various stakeholders, putting that into a standard, which then forms a framework which can be used by the food industry as a way of actually achieving best practice in terms of food safety and quality, which is also about managing quality. So we see ourselves very much as facilitators and condensers of the best information to create a standard which allows people then to aspire to that standard, improve standards within the food industry, and for that to be recognised through the result of an audit and a certification, which in turn hopefully gives confidence to the industry. So that's very much.
Thank you, David. John.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen. My name is John O'Brien. I've had in my career many positions. I've been a university lecturer, I've been head of food safety in Denmark, I've been chief executive of the Food Safety Authority of Ireland, and I'm in Nestle in the context of the food safety program management. My responsibility has always been the same. And one of the things I wanted to pick up on this morning's discussion, Gail mentioned legal responsibility and he mentioned moral responsibility. I think also, as we're in an IFST meeting, there is the important context of professional responsibility as well. And I think this brings then to the heart of the discussion, the idea of doing the right thing the right way. Now, in my role, my team do the risk assessments for Nestle. We work on a global basis. It's fun because there are many products, many categories, and indeed many problems. This is, I think, what is stimulating. The key issue is learning. At the heart of what we do is, of course, continuous improvement. And part of that is, of course, the idea of looking to the future and trying, again, to quote Churchill, avoiding mistakes of the past. Part of that responsibility is also engaging in original research. The consumer is changing and society is changing. The expectations are different. If we do tomorrow what we do today, we won't be in business anymore. So it is important, I think, in this type of forum to explore what will be done differently, how we will evolve the safety of the food system. I think it's important as well, we work on developing new standards at Nestle. We work with a range of organisations to do that. I think it's important as well that we engage more, that there is more collaboration. I don't like being in a court to talk about food safety because courts are, by definition, adversarial. And one of the issues I feel very strongly about currently is that there is too much diversity and there's too little cooperation. On the positive side, there is more willingness, I believe, than ever to engage in cooperation. So I think we need now to move to the action part of the equation.
Thank you. Gavin?
I don't know why I'm on the hard chair.
Yeah. It's a sympathy vote.
So I'm representing the Food Standards Agency. For those who don't know, it's interesting. Gail talked about acts of Parliament in the US, and the Food Standards Act in 1999 was an act of Parliament to create a non-ministerial government department to look after the food interests of UK consumers. The Food Standards Agency was established shortly after that. So it's important that we're non-ministerial, but we are actually a government department. And at the heart of what we do are issues principally to do with safety, but I'll expand a little bit on that to illustrate why some of the issues we've heard earlier to do with kind of globalisations and food systems, etc., start becoming important if you're actually going to address the safety. Secondly is my specific role in that. I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor, which is a part-time secondment role. It's a model which is used widely in the United Kingdom. It's not political, so even if the government changes in 2 weeks' time, I stay put. And it's actually won confidence around the world. What it is most of the major science-based departments in government have an independent person come in for 4 to 6 years who bring in external networks and independent challenge. The job to make sure that the best science and evidence possible is being used, to challenge the board, to challenge the executive, of which I sit on both of those, to ensure that science and evidence is truly at the heart of what is going on. The third thing I want to mention is in terms of the evolving strategy of the Food Standards Agency. Many people who have been involved in either the workshops or looked on the web will know that the strap line has evolved from safer food to food we can trust, which perhaps brings in some of the issues that we've been dealing with here, and to get to the point of food that you can trust. There are 3 underpinning pillars to that. We talked about consumer rights and a consumer charter, which we could pick up later, not a particularly well-liked term amongst the social scientists, and we decided not to actually move forward with that terminology. But the idea is being that the consumer has a right to be protected from an unacceptable risk, the right to be able to make informed decisions, and then the right to have the best food future possible, which is a relatively new concept, but it's very important in terms of driving the others. You notice that was free, and most of my civil service colleagues always talk about having 3 points. I've got 4 because I don't like going with the flow, and it's to prove that I offer independent challenge to them. But, and the 4th point I want to raise, I think, is we hear a lot about the word people, and I think that's really important. And actually what's interesting as an organisation is the adoption and the significance that social science is playing in what we do. So we actually have a social science advisory committee, a government committee that look at the social science that's going on, and a social scientist representative on each of the committees looking at microbes, toxins, etc., etc. Now, why is that important? We've heard so much about the role of people, and I, even though I am a natural scientist by training, recognise that actually these very complex problems you need to understand the full range of disciplines, and the social science being really important in that. And I can give you an excellent example. I was asked to go to Rome to the FAO to offer some input on how you would go about assessing the risks of genetically engineered plants, which were being developed by the Gates Foundation for Sub-Saharan African global food security. And the project was very successful in delivering a drought-tolerant plant to Sub-Saharan Africa. The scientists concerned were very concerned when actually the project had no development impact whatsoever. And it was only when some social scientists and international development people said that the crop that they had used in that part of Africa was the only crop that males look after. And therefore, by doing it with males, we had no development impact at all, because none of the money would flow to the village and the community and education, etc. It would flow to the local town where the man would go off and spend it. An excellent example of wonderful science but having no impact because they're not talking to the right people.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, panelists, for the introductions. I'm happy to open it to the floor for questions. Can I just remind you to say who you are and where you're from so the panelists know who they're responding to, and also if a particular panelist you want a response from, then if you want to name them, that's great. Otherwise, we'll pass it to the panel. One. Yeah. Who's going to go up the microphone?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hello, my name is John Bassett. I'm a food safety consultant. As a food safety professional, I'm not necessarily surprised that listeria has been publicly associated with ice cream. I'm thinking of the Blue Bell outbreak in the US. But hearing from US regulators in the last few days, I was a little concerned or surprised that the levels they were talking about were 1 to 10 CFU per gram, affecting, okay, these are vulnerable consumers in hospital. But I was just wondering then what the panel thinks in terms of, is this a looming issue of importance for European consumers and manufacturers? And in particular, I guess I'm thinking of consumer voice and as Nestle and maybe also Diet as part of the regulatory agency.
Thank you. We'll start with John. Can you have the response first of all?
I haven't looked into the details of the Blue Bell case, John, in that much detail. What surprised me about it, looking at the summary, is how long it's been going on. I think I mentioned 3 to 5 years, something like that. So this is quite astonishing. So it looks quite bad for that particular company, I think, in terms of its future. I remember the listeria thing. We do need to get some harmonisation on this. Many of the people here probably have seen the famous poster with the items that are legal in the US and the things that are banned in the US. Legal in the US, you've got the guns, the M16s and so on, and illegal, you have the French cheeses. And so we need to get again better international perspective here on risk management of this theory, because it's not managed anyway in the same way in different countries. And I think not only it's got to be science-based. It's got to be based on basically in proportion to the risk. But I think it's also leading to confusion on the part of consumers in different countries.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's an interesting question. I think the one point I didn't make which is relevant to this is actually we've heard a lot today about the increasing complexity of the food system and the increasing complexity of the challenges we face. The problem is that the one thing that's got no more complex, in fact, it's got simpler, is the resources for tackling those problems. So the issue, which is a big challenge, is how you begin to prioritise what you're looking at. So within the Food Standards Agency, for instance, I'm often challenged by my scientific or policy colleagues in terms of why, if you just look at number of cases and hospitalisations, etc., the sort of microbial end often comes out easier to measure than the chemical toxin end. And yet, if you talk to members of the public, most people in that situation prefer to have a bout of microbial food poisoning for a few days rather than a long-term chemical exposure, which is difficult to kind of quantify or qualify. So you mentioned specifically listeria. I think in our way of looking, listeria, we are very interested in it within the UK, because not only is it a large number of people potentially affected, but the other thing we've not heard a lot about is that when one looks at risk, you're looking at the hazard and the exposure, but the vulnerability. So there is this question of a particularly vulnerable group being affected, and actually if you look at demographics too, that we know that vulnerable group are a group who firstly are going to grow in number. Secondly, the health service is under strain as well, so when they are affected, they're more likely to end up in hospital and all the complications associated with that. So I think what we're trying to do is really get our head around this prioritisation issue in terms of a complex problem and relatively limited resources in terms of where you might put your money. When we look about education, I mean, one of the things that we've actually been brainstorming is whether you might actually almost have consumer votes. So you can do an economic analysis of what brings the most economic impact. You can do a hospital epidemiological approach of how many people are affected. You might do a vote in terms of what really worries the public. I mean, the public are really worried about TSE type things, but if you actually look at the economics and the numbers associated with that, that doesn't stack up against the actual perceived worries. So looking at those different lenses are important.
Thank you, Guy.
John, I wanted to add one more point to just following that. Rather than focusing on the product standards, I think what's going to really help in the future is the application, the more widespread application of whole genome sequencing. And this is something Nestle is heavily involved in terms of research, and we've got several sequencers which are in the process of replacing conventional typing technologies. I believe FDA have about 8,000 strains sequenced currently of salmonella and of listeria. This will help us. I mean, if that's as we're in court, this is the incontrovertible evidence, I think, that we need.
Thank you. Sue, you've got a quick comment.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I much about the outbreaks that you were talking about, but I think, as you say, it reinforces that listeria is still really important. And I think it's right that the Food Standards Agency has this big focus on Campylobacter at the moment, but I think it shows that it's important that you can't neglect these other risks. And when we won the ACMSF ages ago, we were looking at why there was this increase in listeria in older populations, and the ACMSF has obviously still been looking at that. And I think there's potentially an issue about whether the people who are vulnerable necessarily even realise that they are part of vulnerable groups, and how you reinforce the Food Standards Agency's advice to people so that they're aware of it. I thought Guy's point about risk perception was interesting, and the issue around TSEs. And I think we have to be careful not to focus too much on just the numbers when we're talking about risk, because I think it's about the nature of the risk, and so therefore listeria is a particularly nasty bug that obviously has quite severe consequences. Campylobacter does too. But I think in relation to TSEs, one of the reasons that is still something that is in the public consciousness is just the nature of the illness that is affected if things go wrong, and the fact that it is something that is preventable if you have the right controls in place.
David, do you have any additional comments?
Okay. Well, I don't think the only thing I would add is I think it's really interesting. I was at the conference earlier this week, and I think as science moves on and our ability to actually detect and measure things moves forward, we're starting to find more and more things which previously we thought were safe. And I think it does mean that we will be identifying new risks, and I think it's going to be really important that we have a sort of a grown-up approach to looking at those risks and how we actually proportion our resources to actually tackle those risks. Because I think increasingly lots of new things will come up, as indeed even in the food fraud area, we're constantly finding new things or new problems, and we've got scarce resources. And I think it is about having that grown-up approach to thinking about the risks and what they represent, and making sure that we use our resources appropriately.
Thank you. Another question. Tom.
Thank you very much. My name is Tom Miller. I'm a retired catering technologist. I'd like to ask the panel, bearing in mind we have an election in May, whether they, after the election, if we have a different government, you would urge them to reconstitute the FSA in its original form rather than the dispersed form that we currently have.
Right, here was the start. Guy, you were the first to ask us. Are you allowed to answer?
I'm afraid it's permanent at the moment, so I wouldn't be in a position to comment on that. I welcome yours.
To my earlier comment, I think what's important is communication among the different. I mean, whether one is an agency A, agency B, department A, department B, that isn't necessarily the issue. It's the communication, I think, that is at the core of this. Are the right people talking to the right people?
Yes, not much more I can add. It is really about efficiency of the structure and how it actually operates rather than have a particular people on that structure.
Sue, you've probably some experience with the FSA and committees.
Yes, I mean, I think when the FSA was set up, there was a lot of debate about what its remit should be, but it was felt that it needed to have that broad remit of food safety and standards and nutrition as well. I don't think anything has really changed. I think the horse meat issue showed that there was some confusion where the FSA had responsibility for enforcement of standards, but didn't have policy responsibility for food standards issues. And it can often be difficult to see where something becomes, where the line is between a standards issue and a safety issue. I think you have a situation now, if you look at some of the more complex issues, like something like cloning, say, you've got the Food Standards Agency responsible for safety, then you have DEFRA responsible for labelling aspects. They've obviously always been responsible for some aspects of welfare. But when we're looking at risk analysis and risk perception and how you balance some of these issues, I think it's more difficult when those different elements are dealt with by different agencies. But I'd also agree that it's about how you actually do it, because if the FSA was to be given these responsibilities, then it needs to make sure that it deals with them effectively and that it is proactive and it's tough and that it drives forward the sorts of changes that are needed on behalf of consumers. So yes, we think it should go. I think just as well to point out that the landscape is slightly different, because obviously from the 1st of April we've now got Food Standards Scotland, and interestingly that does have responsibility for all of these aspects still as well. So we'll have quite an interesting situation where it'll be interesting to see how the FSS approaches things and how the FSA approaches things, and hopefully there will be effective coordination between the two.
Thank you, Sue. And hopefully that's useful for you, Guy, in terms of input.
What I can say is that the FSA's current model of having a chief scientific advisor like myself is that I actually work with the government's chief scientist, Sir Mark Walcott, and the DEFRA's chief scientist, Dame Sally Davies, the chief medical officer. And so that does enable that sort of cross-talk, etc., depending if you want to talk.
Right, hold on. Mike first.
Thank you very much. Just to continue that discussion, my name is Mike Knowles, by the way, former chief scientist of MAF. I just wonder if we were actually arguing for the recreation of MAF. It was the only agency in the Western world that had total responsibility for the whole food chain, including fish, which was never even discussed each morning. So I just wonder, with a different type of oversight, whether that is what we're really looking forward to reinventing. I'd have the panel's views on that, with Sue last.
Yeah. Sue, go first.
Well, there was a report called the Phillips Inquiry, which after BSE, and I think maybe MAF had lots of responsibilities within it, but it didn't have a very clear consumer focus remit. It had a conflict in that it was there to promote economic interests and to protect consumers. And I think at that point, there's a lot of confusion. I think even in how we approach risk analysis, I mean, obviously, I'm sure there's a lot of positive things, but we had a very confused situation in terms of when decisions were based on scientific advice and when they were based on other factors, which was the reason why it was felt necessary to have an arm's length agency. So I think what we would like to see is, as I mentioned in my presentation, is that I think you need to have a joined-up approach and a joined-up strategy and be clear about what the objectives of food policy are, because food obviously serves lots of different functions. And at the moment, we haven't really got any kind of strategy. There was an attempt at the Green Food Project. We've got an agricultural technology strategy at the moment. We haven't really got a strategy that cuts across all government departments. And although Guy may talk to the chief scientist, there isn't a coordination mechanism in terms of a cabinet subcommittee or anything like that that actually brings together the different government departments that deal with food. So we think it's a real opportunity, given that, as I put in that slide, we're dealing with obesity issues, we're dealing with food sustainability, we're dealing with climate change, which I think everybody recognises that there's this perfect storm before, but we haven't really got the right institutional structures to deal with those as effectively as we could do.
So you are arguing for MAF with a different oversight.
Anything else wish to comment? I know we've got a series of questions lined up here. Additional, John?
I think what you're asking, Mike, is what does independence mean, perhaps? And I think whether you have an independent organisation or one that is, has a broad potential conflict agreements, you need courageous professionals who will challenge assumptions and who will speak up when that is necessary. And that's maybe also to the earlier question about you know, the more political question about whether there should be one or several agencies. I think you need courageous people that will not say, it's not my job, but will raise the question when it needs to be raised. I think that's important.
Fully agree. Yeah. Are you allowed to answer this one?
Well, I would argue that the UK having chief scientific advisors rather than chief scientists has actually allowed that to happen. I don't think you were a career chief scientist within NAF, but the model that's been moved towards, where somebody like myself, who's a university professor doing this role for a period of time, enables challenge, etc., in a way which isn't always possible elsewhere. And that model is highly regarded. And the classic example was which C.P. Snow talks about, why the government's chief scientists were too bombing in Germany with radar with politics versus science.
Next question is one down here first, then there. Okay, I'll do that one next. We'll see the microphone there, then I'll grab that here.
Hiya, my name is Helena Blackshaw. Last week I was Head of Quality Food Safety and Sustainability for a large agribusiness. Next week I'm going to be moving to authenticate information systems to connect the whole global food industry together to try and gain transparency. Now, I think the technical managers who sat here, been in technical now for 20 years now. In the past 2 years it's changed considerably. Gone are the days of QC, there's more commercial awareness. However, we've got this drive to obviously gain this transparency and collaborate together, but technical management have not got a loud voice at the moment. It's still a very commercially driven business out there. How do you see, what are the challenges that you could support of, these challenges you could support of to raise the profile of technical management, to be able to look at vulnerability assessments, test it?
Yeah, I think one of the, I would say, beneficial outcomes of the horsemeat crisis was it got procurement people talking with quality management people, with the agriculture people, with the research people. It got people in dialogue. So I think it's going in the right direction. The important thing is not to make the assumption that the threat is gone. When you look at the estimates, food fraud in the US alone is about 40 billion a year. That's the estimate. Fish fraud, I think, accounts now in some form or other. Most of the fish consumed in the world has either been caught illegally or has been substituted for another species. So I think what we have to continue to do is to remind people that it's now. It's not gone away. It's still there, and the cost implications are very high. So I think that's the key, is to get the procurement people involved, because they are concerned, but they don't have the technical know-how to know where to look. That's where the science-based vulnerability assessment, I think, will be very useful to help look in the right place.
David, you work with the technical people extensively, so.
Yes, and it's quite interesting because one of the challenges we always get back is the cost of things like audits, the cost of the work that technical teams do. It's really very difficult to demonstrate how much money you may have saved your business because of the approach that you've taken in terms of managing supply chains. And that's always the really big challenge out there. And I guess to an extent, we learn from everybody who trips up, and we see how much money it's cost them because they haven't done what you're probably doing in your own businesses, and we can develop from that. I'm interested from our own point of view with the standards. One of the things that we have noticed with change to the unannounced audits is a greater sharing of responsibility. Because too often what happens is, in our food factories, people are siloed. As a technical manager who's responsible for ensuring that we do this and we meet this standard. Production, we're all about making sure that we hit production targets and get as much product out as possible. And sometimes doing things like subtle moves into an unannounced audit actually means that everybody has to be involved in understanding food safety systems in the factory. And that shared responsibility, can empower the technical team, but also means that everybody then has to be involved in it, because the failure is not the failure of one person, but it's the failure of the whole site and the consequences of desire. So I think it's that sort of cultural move that's needed.
Just a couple of observations.